My name is Kalen. Or, it was. Old man Tiber used to say names were like shadows, changing with the light. Now, I mostly go by Sunstone. It's what the others call me, the ones who remember. It's been a long time. A lot of sunrises and sunsets since the world felt solid, since the stories felt true. But I remember. I remember the smell of wood smoke and wild thyme, the weight of flint in my hand, and the face of my grandfather, etched with the wisdom of the mountains. We lived in a place called Samos, though back then it wasn't Samos like the traders talk about now, with stone buildings and proper roads. It was a tangle of green, a wild heart beating on the edge of the wine-dark sea. The year, well, years weren't something we counted much. Old man Tiber, he tried, looking at the moon and the stars, but mostly he said it was the time of the great apes, the time before the remembering. I think, if I had to guess, it was around 9 million years ago. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. It feels like a dream now, a hazy warmth. Our people, the ones I knew, weren't like the people you see now. We were closer to the earth. Stronger, maybe. We walked upright, mostly, but we still climbed trees like monkeys when we needed to. Our faces weren't smooth like yours, they were heavier, with big brow ridges and jaws that could crack nuts and bones. We weren't stupid, not at all. We just saw the world differently. We felt it more. I was a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 summers old, when the remembering started to fade for the others. I was always a quiet one, more interested in watching the lizards sun themselves on the rocks than wrestling with the other boys. My grandfather, Theron, he said I had the eyes of a hawk, always scanning, always noticing. He was the storyteller, the keeper of the old ways. He'd sit by the fire at night, his face flickering in the flames, and tell us about the first ones, the ones who walked with the great apes, the ones who learned to make fire and shape stone. Our village wasn't much to look at. A cluster of huts built from branches and mud, nestled in a small valley near a freshwater spring. We wore clothes made from animal skins, tanned and softened with fat and smoke. The smell of smoke was always with us, clinging to our hair and clothes. It smelled like home. We hunted deer and wild boar, gathered berries and roots, and fished in the sea. Life was hard, but it was good. It was enough. I remember the feel of the sun on my skin, hot and heavy. The taste of roasted boar, smoky and rich. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore, a constant rhythm that lulled me to sleep. The air always smelled of salt and pine and something else, something wild and untamed. Theron was teaching me to knap flint, to chip away at the stone until it formed a sharp edge. It was frustrating work. My hands were small and clumsy, and I kept cutting myself. He'd just smile, a network of wrinkles crinkling around his eyes, and say, "Patience, little hawk. The stone remembers. You must listen to it." He showed me how to find the right kind of flint, how to hold the hammerstone, how to strike with just the right amount of force. He told me stories while we worked, stories about the great apes, the Ouranopithecus, he called them. He said they were our ancestors, the ones who first stood on 2 legs and looked at the stars. They were powerful creatures, he'd say, his voice low and gravelly. Stronger than us, maybe, but not as clever. They didn't know how to make fire, how to shape stone. They lived in the trees, mostly, safe from the dangers on the ground. He said the first ones learned from the great apes, watched them, copied them. They learned how to find food, how to avoid predators, how to survive in the wild. But they also learned something more. They learned how to think, how to plan, how to dream. That's what makes us different, Theron said. That's what makes us human. Not our strength, not our size, but our minds. I didn't understand everything he said, not then. I was just a boy, more interested in chasing butterflies than pondering the mysteries of existence. But I listened. I always listened. One day, while we were hunting, we came across a group of great apes. They were huge, covered in thick, reddish-brown fur. They were foraging for fruit in a grove of fig trees, their powerful arms reaching high into the branches. I was scared. I'd seen them before, from a distance, but I'd never been this close. They were so different. They didn't look at us with curiosity, or fear, or even anger. They just ignored us. It was like we weren't even there. Theron raised his hand, signaling me to stay still. He didn't want to provoke them. We watched them for a long time, fascinated and apprehensive. They moved with a grace and power that was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. I noticed something strange. One of the apes, a young female, was holding a stone. She wasn't using it as a tool, not exactly. She was just turning it over in her hands, examining it with a curious expression. Theron saw it too. He nudged me gently. "Look," he whispered. "She's thinking." I didn't understand what he meant. How could an ape be thinking? But as I watched her, I began to see it. There was something in her eyes, a spark of intelligence, a flicker of awareness. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "They're getting closer to the remembering," Theron said, his voice filled with a strange mixture of hope and sadness. "But it will be a long time before they truly understand." We left the apes and continued our hunt. But I couldn't shake the image of the female ape and the stone from my mind. It felt like a sign, a glimpse into the future. As the seasons changed, I noticed other changes too. The weather seemed more unpredictable, the winters colder, the summers hotter. The animals were becoming scarcer, and the plants were growing differently. Theron said it was a sign of the changing world, a time of upheaval and transition. He said the great apes were struggling to adapt, that their way of life was coming to an end. "The world is changing, little hawk," he said. "And we must change with it. We must learn to be more resourceful, more adaptable, more clever." He started teaching me new skills, how to build better shelters, how to make more efficient tools, how to find new sources of food. He said we had to be prepared for anything. But even as we prepared, I could feel a sense of unease growing within me. It was like something was missing, something was fading away. The stories Theron told seemed less vivid, less real. The memories of the first ones were becoming blurred and fragmented. The other people in the village were changing too. They were becoming less interested in the old ways, less willing to listen to Theron's stories. They were starting to focus more on the immediate needs of survival, on finding food and shelter. I tried to remind them of the past, to tell them the stories I'd learned from Theron. But they just looked at me with blank expressions, as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Those are just stories, Kalen," they'd say. "They don't matter anymore. What matters is surviving." I felt lost and alone. It was like I was the only one who remembered, the only one who cared about the past. One day, Theron fell ill. He was old, of course, but he'd always been strong and resilient. This was different. He was weak and feverish, and he couldn't eat or drink. I stayed by his side, tending to him as best I could. I brought him water, cooled his forehead with damp cloths, and told him stories. But nothing seemed to help. As he lay dying, he called me to his side. He took my hand in his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, little hawk," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The remembering is fading. It's happening faster now. You must keep the stories alive. You must remember." He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, smooth stone. It was a beautiful stone, a pale yellow color, with streaks of orange and red. "This is a sunstone," he said. "It holds the memories of our ancestors. Keep it safe. And never forget." He closed his eyes and took a final, shuddering breath. And then he was gone. I held the sunstone tightly in my hand, tears streaming down my face. I felt like a part of me had died with him. After Theron's death, things fell apart quickly. The village scattered, the people drifting away in search of food and shelter. I tried to stay, to keep the memories alive, but it was no use. I was just a boy, alone and powerless. I wandered for a long time, traveling from place to place, searching for someone who remembered, someone who cared. But I found no one. Everyone was too focused on survival, too caught up in the present to worry about the past. Eventually, I ended up on the coast, living among a group of fishermen. They were a rough and practical people, more interested in catching fish than listening to stories. They called me Sunstone, because of the stone I always carried with me. I learned to fish, to build boats, to navigate by the stars. I learned to survive. But I never forgot. I never forgot Theron, or the stories he told, or the memories he entrusted to me. I kept the Sunstone hidden, close to my heart. It was my only connection to the past, my only reminder of who I was. As the years passed, I noticed more and more changes. The great apes disappeared completely, replaced by new creatures, smaller and more agile. The climate continued to change, becoming warmer and drier. And the people were changing too. They were becoming more like each other, less like the wild, untamed creatures I remembered. They were learning to build bigger and better shelters, to make more sophisticated tools, to organize themselves into larger and more complex societies. They were becoming modern. I watched it all happen, a silent observer, a living relic of a forgotten past. I tried to tell them about the first ones, about the great apes, about the old ways. But they didn't understand. They thought I was crazy, a senile old man rambling about things that never were. "Those are just myths, Sunstone," they'd say. "They're not real." But I knew they were real. I remembered. I remembered the smell of wood smoke and wild thyme, the weight of flint in my hand, and the face of my grandfather, etched with the wisdom of the mountains. I continued to carry the Sunstone, a tangible link to a world that was fading away. It was a burden, but it was also a gift. It reminded me of who I was, of where I came from, of the importance of remembering. Now, I am very old. My body is weak and frail, and my memory is fading. But I still remember. I still remember the stories, the faces, the smells, the sounds. And I still have the Sunstone. I sit here on the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It's a beautiful sight, but it's also a sad one. I know that my time is coming to an end. Soon, I will join Theron, and the other first ones, in the land of shadows. But before I go, I want to tell you one last thing. Don't forget. Don't forget the past. Don't forget the stories. Don't forget the memories. Because if you forget, you will lose yourself. You will lose your connection to the earth, to your ancestors, to your humanity. Remember the great apes. Remember the first ones. Remember the Sunstone. Remember, everything. The sea wind whispers around me, carrying the scent of salt and pine. I close my eyes, and I see Theron's face again, smiling at me. You did well, little hawk, he says. You kept the remembering alive. And then, everything fades to black. The sunstone warms in my hand, a final, comforting weight. The waves continue to crash against the shore, a timeless rhythm that will continue long after I am gone. The world keeps turning, forgetting, and remembering in turns, and the echoes of the great apes, and the boy who held the sunstone, drift on the wind. Perhaps, someday, someone will listen. Perhaps, someday, someone will remember too. It's a long time, a very long time, but even shadows can hold a memory. The fading wasn't a clean break, not like falling asleep. It was more like sand slipping through your fingers, each grain a memory, a feeling, a connection. After the stillness, after the warmth left my hand, the sunstone didn't simply disappear. It remained, a weight in the hands of a young woman named Lyra. Lyra was a gatherer, one of the coastal folk who'd slowly built a life amongst the ruins of what they called the Old Ones places, crumbling stone walls, overgrown paths, fragments of a world they didn't understand. She found me, or rather, she found what was left of me, nestled amongst the rocks where the tide had carried me. She didn't know who I was, not at first. She just saw an old man, peaceful in death, clutching a strange, yellow stone. She wasn't like the others. They'd have tossed the stone aside, a pretty trinket with no practical use. Lyra, though, she felt something. A pull, a resonance. She kept the sunstone, not as a treasure, but as a companion. I wasn't gone, not entirely. I became, woven into the stone, a whisper in the wind, a flicker in the firelight. I could see through Lyra's eyes, feel her emotions, experience the world as she did. It was a strange, disorienting existence. I was both present and absent, a ghost in the machine of her life. Lyra lived in a small settlement built around a sheltered cove. They were skilled fishermen and gatherers, but their lives were hard. The winters were brutal, the summers scorching. They were constantly battling the elements, struggling to survive. Their language was different now, a simplified version of the tongue I remembered. Words had lost their nuance, their poetry. They spoke of practical things, fish, weather, tools, rarely of stories or dreams. The remembering had truly faded. Lyra was an exception. She had a curious mind, a thirst for knowledge. She'd spend hours exploring the ruins of the Old Ones places, trying to decipher their secrets. She'd collect fragments of pottery, pieces of metal, and smooth, worn stones, arranging them in patterns, trying to understand their meaning. She often held the sunstone while she worked, tracing its contours with her fingers. Sometimes, she'd close her eyes and press it to her forehead, as if trying to unlock its secrets. And sometimes I could feel a faint echo of my own memories, a fleeting image of Theron's face, a whisper of a forgotten story. One day, Lyra discovered a cave hidden behind a waterfall. It was a large, spacious cave, decorated with strange markings on the walls. The markings weren't like anything she'd ever seen before. They weren't simple drawings of animals or people. They were complex, abstract patterns, filled with symbols and shapes. She spent weeks studying the markings, trying to decipher their meaning. She'd copy them onto pieces of bark, arranging them in different combinations, hoping to find a pattern. She'd consult with the other members of the settlement, but no one could help her. They just dismissed the markings as the scribbles of madmen. But Lyra refused to give up. She felt that the markings held a key, a clue to the mysteries of the past. And she felt that the Sunstone was somehow connected to them. She began to experiment, holding the Sunstone against the markings, tracing their outlines with it. And then, one day, something extraordinary happened. As she pressed the Sunstone against a particular symbol, a faint light emanated from the stone. The symbol on the wall began to glow, and a strange humming sound filled the cave. Lyra gasped, stepping back in surprise. She stared at the glowing symbol, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, she saw it. An image began to form on the wall, projected from the glowing symbol. It was a moving image, a flickering scene from the past. She saw a group of people, dressed in animal skins, gathered around a fire. They were chanting, singing, dancing. They were performing a ritual, a ceremony. She saw the great apes, lumbering through the forest, their powerful bodies casting long shadows. She saw the first ones, watching them, learning from them. She saw Theron, my grandfather, sitting by a fire, telling stories to a group of children. She saw me, a small boy, listening intently, my eyes wide with wonder. The images flashed by, a whirlwind of sights and sounds. Lyra felt overwhelmed, as if she were being transported back in time. And then, the images stopped. The light faded, the humming ceased, and the symbol on the wall returned to its original state. Lyra stood there, trembling, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe what she'd seen. It was impossible. It was a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was a memory. A memory unlocked by the Sunstone, a memory preserved in the markings on the wall. She realized that the cave was a sacred place, a repository of knowledge, a link to the past. And she realized that the Sunstone was the key to unlocking its secrets. She continued to explore the cave, experimenting with the Sunstone, unlocking more and more memories. She learned about the first ones, about the great apes, about the world that had existed before her own. She learned about the importance of storytelling, about the power of memory, about the need to preserve the past. And she began to share her discoveries with the others in the settlement. At first, they were skeptical. They dismissed her stories as fantasies, as the ramblings of a dreamer. But Lyra persisted. She showed them the images she'd unlocked, the evidence of a forgotten past. Slowly, gradually, they began to listen. They began to believe. They started to gather around the fire at night, listening to Lyra's stories. They started to ask questions, to explore the ruins of the old ones' places, to search for clues to the past. The remembering had begun to stir. But it wasn't easy. There were those who resisted, who clung to their old ways, who feared the unknown. They saw the past as a threat, a distraction from the present. One of these was Kale, the leader of the settlement. He was a strong, pragmatic man, focused on survival. He didn't believe in stories or dreams. He believed in hard work and practical solutions. He saw Lyra's activities as a waste of time, a dangerous distraction from the important task of preparing for the winter. He warned her to stop, to focus on more practical matters. But Lyra refused to listen. She knew that the past was important, that it held the key to their future. "We can't just ignore our history, Kale," she said. "We need to understand where we came from, what our ancestors learned. It will help us to survive." "Survival is about catching fish and building shelters, not about chasing ghosts," Kale retorted. "You're wasting your time, Lyra. And you're leading the others astray." Their conflict escalated, dividing the settlement. Some sided with Lyra, drawn to her stories and her vision of the past. Others sided with Kale, clinging to their traditional ways. The tension reached a breaking point one night, during a fierce storm. The waves were crashing against the shore, the wind was howling, and the rain was lashing down. Kale accused Lyra of bringing bad luck, of angering the spirits. He demanded that she stop her activities, that she destroy the Sunstone. Lyra refused. She stood her ground, holding the Sunstone tightly in her hand. "This stone is a gift, Kale," she said. "It's a connection to our ancestors. It's a reminder of who we are." Kale lunged at her, trying to snatch the Sunstone from her grasp. But Lyra dodged him, and the stone slipped from her hand, falling to the ground. In the ensuing struggle, the Sunstone was broken. It shattered into a dozen pieces, scattering across the cave floor. Lyra cried out in anguish. She knelt down and gathered the fragments of the stone, her hands trembling. Kale stood over her, his face contorted with anger. "Now you've done it," he said. "You've destroyed the last link to the past." But he was wrong. As Lyra held the fragments of the Sunstone in her hand, she felt a surge of energy, a wave of memories. The broken stone hadn't destroyed the connection to the past. It had amplified it. She saw a vision, a panoramic view of the world as it had been millions of years ago. She saw the great apes roaming the forests, the first ones building their villages, Theron telling his stories. She saw everything. And she realized that the memories weren't just stored in the stone. They were stored in her mind, in her heart, in her soul. The Sunstone had been a catalyst, a trigger. But the remembering had always been within her, waiting to be awakened. She stood up, her eyes shining with newfound determination. "You can't destroy the past, Kale," she said. "It lives on in us. It lives on in our stories. It lives on in our memories." She began to speak, to tell the stories she'd learned from the Sunstone, to share the visions she'd seen. And as she spoke, the others in the settlement began to remember too. They remembered their ancestors, their traditions, their dreams. They remembered the importance of storytelling, the power of memory, the need to preserve the past. The remembering had returned, stronger than ever before. Kale, humbled and ashamed, lowered his head. He realized that he'd been wrong, that he'd underestimated the power of the past. He apologized to Lyra, and he pledged to support her efforts to preserve the memories of their ancestors. And so, the settlement began to rebuild, not just their homes and their tools, but their culture, their identity, their connection to the past. Lyra became their storyteller, their historian, their keeper of the flame. She taught the children the stories of the first ones, the stories of the great apes, the stories of the Sunstone. And as she told those stories, I lived again, not as a physical being, but as a voice in her heart, a whisper in her mind, a memory in her soul. The sand continued to slip through my fingers, but now, it felt less like a loss, and more like a continuation. The remembering wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about building a future rooted in wisdom, in knowledge, in understanding. And as I watched Lyra and her people rebuild their lives, I knew that the echoes of the great apes, and the boy who held the Sunstone, would continue to resonate through the ages.